On this Sunday night, meteorological winter begins with a blast. Heavy snow pummels communities from BC to Ontario.
I'd never seen this much snow, 4 feet, 5 feet.
As Environment Canada releases its winter forecast. Syria and civil war.
The Syrian government's forces have been extremely weak and have rapidly retreated.
The sudden offensive by Islamist rebel fighters. Why it matters for other conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine. Pipeline politics as Donald Trump pushes to revive Keystone XL. Another pipeline project on the West Coast hits a wall.
We're celebrating kind of the first step of the end of the PRGT pipeline.
Plus, food safety fears. Contaminated cucumbers and carrots. What's behind the recent wave of recalls on produce?
Global National. Reporting tonight, Jeff Semple.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. Winter is officially in full swing, at least according to the calendars used by meteorologists and climatologists, and many Canadians didn't need a weather expert to tell them that. In central Ontario, residents are digging themselves out after a relentless snow squall pummeled that region. Further west, the prairie provinces are now enduring frigid temperatures, while parts of BC are dealing with heavy snow and freezing rain. That messy weather weekend comes as Environment Canada released its predictions for the winter. Braydon Jagger Haines has our top story tonight.
Winter rearing its head in a dramatic fashion. For a second day, intense snow squalls have bombarded central and northern parts of Ontario with more than 140 centimeters of snow.
I'd never seen this much snow.
Main highways shut down for hours, restricting emergency services. Heavy snow leaving thousands in the dark. The town of Gravenhurst in the Muskoka region was forced to declare a state of emergency.
So far, and thank goodness, there have been no injuries or reported injuries or sickness or fatalities, which is really quite remarkable considering all the cars that we've seen in the ditch.
I'm going to be here until April, probably.
Ontario Provincial Police saying crews were still working to get the remaining stranded vehicles off a stretch of snow-covered Highway 11. Out west, harsh weather hit BC drivers off guard, closing the Trans-Canada Highway overnight following a bad crash. In the prairies, central Saskatchewan was under an extreme cold warning with wind chill temperatures in the negative 30s.
Meanwhile, in some parts of the country, like southern Quebec, fall-like temperatures remain in effect, with little snow in the future forecast, putting annual winter activities and events in jeopardy.
Race directors of Mont-Tremblant's World Cup were forced to pull the plug ahead of next weekend's scheduled women's race, cancelled due to warm weather and poor conditions.
And here, Ottawa and Montreal, two of the snowiest cities in the world, and they'd had a trace of snow up to the 1st of December. Come on. I mean, what is more crazy than that?
Environment Canada is predicting a warmer than usual winter for most of the country, especially the far north. But it's unlikely to eclipse last year's warmest winter on record. And it's already been a harsh season for some. Braydon Jagger Haines, Global News, Montreal.
And it's a similar picture south of the border, where parts of the U.S. Northeast are also digging out. Plow operators had their work cut out as heavy snow blanketed several states in the midst of U.S. Thanksgiving, the busiest travel weekend of the year. Governors in Pennsylvania and New York declared disaster emergencies after nearly a meter of snow fell, with more expected tomorrow. Football fans answered the call from the Buffalo Bills after the NFL team asked for volunteers to dig out their stadium in time for tonight's game. And turning to breaking news from Washington, in the final weeks of his term, U.S. President Joe Biden has now pardoned his son. Hunter Biden had faced a possible prison sentence for his gun-related and tax evasion convictions. The president had long insisted he would not use the extraordinary powers of his Oval Office to help family members, but in a statement tonight, Biden argued the charges against his son were brought for political reasons. Hunter was convicted earlier this year of tax evasion and lying on a gun purchasing form, falsely claiming that he was not using illegal drugs at the time. Turning now to the other big story of the day, the shock offensive in Syria. That country has been gripped by civil war for over a decade, but the conflict had remained mostly frozen for the past few years until last week. Syrian rebels belonging to a militant group known as HTS launched an offensive in Syria's second city of Aleppo. That escalation is now spreading to neighbouring provinces, which have largely been under the control of Syria's strongman ruler Bashar al-Assad. Catherine Urquhart reports on the wider implications for the region.
Syrian and Russian jets launched retaliatory airstrikes on Sunday, targeting an Islamist rebel uprising. Volunteers with the Syrian rescue group, the White Helmets, rushed to save the injured. The strikes follow a surprise sweep by Syrian rebels through government-held towns. A statue of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's brother Bassel was toppled in Aleppo Saturday amid this latest challenge to Assad.
My guess is that the Turkish-backed opposition forces thought they had an opportunity now to regain some of the territory that the Syrian government had taken from them 3 or 4 years ago to the west of the city of Aleppo.
The rebels are part of a group called HTS. Assad calls them terrorists, and the White House, which opposes Assad on this question, agrees. The group leading the rebel advance is designated a terrorist organization by the U.S., Joe Biden's national security advisor Jake Sullivan telling CNN. He also stated, at the same time, of course, we don't cry over the fact that the Assad government, backed by Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, are facing certain kinds of pressure.
They are pushing east from the northwestern Syrian province of Idlib. Reason it's also important is that the Syrian government's forces have been extremely weak and have rapidly retreated.
The developments are a significant escalation in Syria and potentially beyond.
I think it's going to affect the relative position of Turkey and different Arab states and Iran, possibly Israel too, because Syria is a kind of proxy battlefield.
Does it mean that the Syrian government is about to collapse? No, but it does suggest that the war is heating up a bit and will heat up until Turkey and Russia come to an agreement about a new ceasefire.
But until there is a ceasefire, countless more are sure to be hurt and killed. Catherine Urquhart, Global News, Vancouver.
As Catherine mentioned, Russian forces are assisting Syria's army in pushing back against the Islamist rebels. The Kremlin has long supported the Syrian regime under Bashar al-Assad, both politically and militarily. Russia has at least 4 military bases inside Syria, including a major naval base in the city of Tartus, which is not far from where that rebel offensive is happening. Vladimir Putin supported the Syrian dictator during his brutal crackdown in the early days of the civil war, which began back in 2011, including when Bashar al-Assad launched chemical weapons attacks against his own civilians. And turning to the growing desperation in Gaza, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees now says it is pausing aid deliveries entering through the main crossing from Israel. The UN agency's head says that route has not been safe for months, with armed gangs hijacking their aid convoys. He also blames Israeli authorities for restricting the amount of aid entering Gaza and for failing to provide safe passage during the ongoing siege. Israel has blamed Hamas for looting those deliveries of aid. A major UN summit in South Korea tasked with tackling plastic pollution has ended in failure. Member nations failed to come up with a global plan to curb plastic pollution. More than 100 nations wanted to cap plastic production, but Saudi Arabia and a handful of other oil-producing countries stood in the way. Plastic, of course, comes from petroleum. They say the focus should be on recycling and curbing plastic waste. The world produces 460 million tons of plastic per year. That is over 1,000 times the weight of the Empire State Building. Food safety experts are sounding the alarm after the recent wave of recalls involving produce linked to salmonella or E. coli contamination. Last week, a U.S. company announced it's recalling cucumbers sold in several Canadian provinces, which has led to dozens of cases of illnesses south of the border. As Nora Fat reports, researchers are blaming what they say is a flawed food inspection system.
Yeah, I have a senior in my house, so food safety is a great concern.
And the latest concern, American cucumbers potentially contaminated with salmonella. Company Sunfed Produce has issued a recall for the vegetable, which was sold from mid-October to late November, including in British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario.
What's really alarming is we're finding more outbreaks.
And food safety professor Keith Warner says animals are typically the source. Contaminated manure could seep into irrigation systems, eventually bringing pathogens to your food. And despite North America having one of the world's longest list of regulations, Warner says food inspection agencies have failed.
The problem we have is taking those regulations and putting them in place. You could even say the pandemic played its own role in it, because a lot of inspections were literally virtual.
Consumers tell us the safety of their food is a big concern.
I think they need to have some safety measure to make sure that before it gets to the store, it gets to us, it's checked properly.
Our trust in the agencies that are supposed to protect children and families definitely goes down.
This number of instances where this is happening is concerning.
The fact that there hasn't been any illness reported in Canada yet is probably a good sign, although I will say that illness tends to be a lagging indicator.
Researchers say death from salmonella is rare, but because the pathogen can survive a large range of conditions, illness is possible. Some of the telltale signs?
Nausea, vomiting, diarrhea.
Cooking food lessens the risk of illness, says Professor Joseph McPhee. But for produce that can't be cooked, don't take a chance.
Yeah, I'm actually worried, especially with my little ones, right?
Noor Rafat, Global News, Toronto.
A resurgence in cases of HIV coming up. Why health officials say AIDS is on the rise here in Canada. This is World AIDS Day, the annual event meant to raise awareness, and a new study is tracking the fight to defeat the virus as a public health threat. According to the United Nations AIDS program, global HIV diagnoses dropped by almost 22% between 2010 and 2021, and during that same period, global HIV deaths also went down by nearly 40%. But as Phil Carpenter explains, case numbers here in Canada are climbing.
Despite the light injection of comedy at an event at Hope Park in Montreal's Village neighbourhood Sunday afternoon, the seriousness of why the annual gathering happened was still evident.
We have a tradition of coming together and celebrating the people we know from our communities who have left us due to HIV and AIDS, but also celebrate our still living communities.
Medical and community workers are surprised and alarmed that the number of new HIV diagnoses has increased in Quebec. According to the latest statistics from the province's Institute of Public Health, there were 422 new HIV diagnoses in the province in 2022, compared to just over 240 the year before and 212 in 2020.
Well, I think we all see our healthcare system in crisis.
Experts are also seeing a jump in new diagnoses across the country. According to Canada's Public Health Agency, there were over 2,400 newly diagnosed HIV cases in the country last year, up 35% over 2022. In Quebec, experts say there are a number of reasons for the increases here. One, underdiagnosis during the height of the COVID pandemic.
Because a lot of the resources, the nursing resources that used to go out with community groups to reach people who are much harder to reach, were recalled in order to deal with COVID.
So much of the testing was cancelled. Another reason some point to, the number of new arrivals to the province.
And some of them we know are living or are diagnosed with HIV, particularly when they arrive in Montreal.
He also points to problems accessing care, particularly at the prevention stage.
Actually, we have a treatment that can prevent by 99% the acquisition of HIV.
But according to Labouche, only half the number of people who need it are getting it. The other factor he thinks is stopping people from getting tested or treated is lingering stigma around HIV.
You can be controlled for HIV, you can have a normal life, most of the time, you can have babies, you can live your life.
One key to controlling HIV spread, say those working in the field, is for governments to improve access invest more in treatment and make it free.
Like the other treatment for sexual transmitted infection, we are free, so why not to do the same for HIV?
The wish for those gathered at this park Sunday is that there'll be increasingly more reasons to hope. Phil Carpenter, Global News, Montreal.
Well, it's a special day for the historic community of Africville in Halifax. A ceremony was held celebrating Africville's inclusion on the UNESCO Heritage List. It's among 22 sites worldwide to be given a new designation linked to the slave trade.
Africville has a new designation, a site of memory and history linked to enslavement and the slave trade. This is so significant because these grounds right now are the only ones in Canada to have this designation.
Africville was a close-knit black community in Halifax for more than a century, but in the 1960s it was demolished by the city. UNESCO says the site stands as a powerful testimony to the practice of slavery in Canada and enslaved people in the United States who fled in search of freedom. Still ahead, pipeline pushback, why plans for a gas pipeline in Western Canada are now in jeopardy. There is mounting opposition to a proposed pipeline project on the West Coast. It's called the Prince Rupert Gas Transmission Line, and it would deliver fossil gas from northeastern BC to an export terminal on the coast. Hereditary chiefs are worried the line will leave at least 2 river systems and their nation's watershed exposed. But as Neithu Garcha tells us, the gas company behind the project, along with another nation closer to the coast, believe it should move forward.
The years-long fight by Gitineau hereditary chiefs against the Prince Rupert gas transmission pipeline has hit a milestone. They say a step forward in their push to stop the liquefied natural gas project in its tracks.
We're celebrating kind of the first step of the end of the PRGT pipeline.
The proposed pipeline had until November 25th to prove it had met a threshold called a substantial start, meaning significant progress towards its completion. The province is reviewing the work done and expects to make a decision in the spring. But Gitineau, a nation which opposes the project, is calling for a new environmental assessment process that's not outdated.
The commitment from this current government to free, prior, informed consent is something that is new since the 2014 environmental certificate.
BC has a new Indigenous environment minister who they hope to convince of their argument.
We're asking for this project to be looked at in the 2024-2025 reality that we all live in, and really looking at our climate crisis that is affecting all of us today.
But the pipeline owners, Western LNG and neighbouring Nisga'a Nation, say they're confident the project will proceed.
I think the significance of the project has to do with a lot of that economic certainty that it could provide.
In a statement, BC's Environmental Assessment Office said if the project is determined to have been substantially started, the environmental assessment certificate remains in effect for the life of the project. But if not, the certificate will have expired and the project cannot proceed without a new environmental assessment. Western LNG says $584 million has been invested in the project, with 42 kilometers of right-of-way cleared, 47 kilometers of access roads established, as well as the construction of 9 permanent bridges and a worker accommodation facility. With the pipeline's future hanging in the balance, all eyes will be on the provincial government's decision in the coming months, which could set a precedent for future resource projects. Neithu Garcha, Global News, Vancouver.
Up next, helping sick children over the holidays. One charity's message for Canadians. Welcome back. Canadians are making plans to spend time with their loved ones during the holiday season, but that's often impossible for families with children requiring hospital care. Charities like Ronald McDonald House are working to keep those families together, but as Catherine Ward explains, growing demand means there often aren't enough rooms to go around.
Wade Butter is a pretty typical 4.5-year-old.
When's your birthday?
March 7th.
Bluey is his favorite show.
I bought a bingo.
He's got his own way of playing Candyland.
Would you like a candy game?
And he's really hoping Santa brings him a Nerf gun this Christmas. But the last year has been tough. In February of 2023, Wade got a fever that wouldn't go away.
The pediatrician started running some tests,
And he was cancer positive, and he told us, and we just entered a blur from there.
It's not something that you would ever think is going to happen to your child. All right, everybody ready?
Okay, let's go.
You go on that side, mister.
Everybody good?
I'm good. I'm good.
The family has logged thousands of kilometers on the road between Cambridge, Ontario, about an hour and a half southwest of Toronto, and McMaster Children's Hospital in Hamilton.
In the last 2 years, we spent more on gas than we spent
ever,
yeah.
A 50-minute drive the family knows by heart.
Sometimes I just go onto autopilot and I blink my eyes and I'm at the hospital.
This is one of thousands of Canadian families making long drives to be with their children.
Families traveled, if you can believe it, over 5.2 million kilometers to be close to their sick child. That's over 130 times around the world.
18,000 Canadian families stayed at Ronald McDonald House last year, meaning less time on the road and more time together.
We could get, a square meal a day there, if not two, and it really just let us focus more on being parents to Wade, being parents to John.
But the needs are growing as the demand more often than not exceeds the number of available rooms. The charity is calling on Canadians to get involved as it hopes to double its footprint over the next 5 years.
We're just turning too many families away from Ronald McDonald houses based on lack of space or no available program option. That's as many as up to 4 out of every 5 families.
Wade still needs regular hospital visits, and he's not out of the woods just yet.
We do have that date in our heads, and at least for me, that does feel like an end of treatment point.
The nightmare is just never ever gonna end, because if one cell remains, we're back to square one.
So for now, the drives continue, with the hope that one day will be their last trip on this route. Catherine Ward, Global News, Toronto.
Hang in there, Wade. That is Global National for this Sunday night. I'm Jeff Semple. Tonight's Your Canada is Kelowna, British Columbia, where the Santa bus is getting ready to roll. It's making stops across the central Okanagan for the next 7 days, collecting donations for the Salvation Army's Christmas Assistance Program. The Santa bus has been an annual tradition for 2 decades, collecting more than $700,000 worth of donations in that time. Thanks for watching. Donna will be back with you tomorrow. Have a great night.